On September 14, 1972, two officers from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police entered a small hardware store on 10th Avenue South in Golden, British Columbia. Golden was a town shaped by rail lines, logging roads, and seasonal traffic moving through the Rocky Mountain corridor. The store had operated under the same ownership since the mid-1950s. Its business records were orderly. Licenses were renewed on time. Local suppliers listed the owner as reliable and consistent. The man behind the counter that morning was Karl-Heinz Schneider, age 51, a naturalized Canadian citizen. The officers were not responding to a complaint. There had been no accusation, no public concern, and no local incident. Their visit followed a request from Ottawa, generated by a review of historical records rather than contemporary events. Several months earlier, during the consolidation of wartime archives, a federal clerk had flagged the discrepancy between Second World War prisoner of war files and post-war immigration records. One POW case from 1945 remained unresolved. The individual had disappeared from Canadian custody during the final weeks of the war and was never formally accounted for. The file had been dormant for more than 25 years. What reopened it was a convergence of dates, locations, and identifying details that now appeared elsewhere in federal records under a different administrative context and a different legal status. The RCMP officers identified themselves and asked Schneider to confirm routine personal information. He complied without hesitation. No search was conducted, no arrest was made. The visit lasted less than 20 minutes. By the time the officers left the store, a case that had effectively ended in 1945 was formally active again. During the Second World War, Canada maintained one of the largest prisoner of war systems among the Allied nations. Between 1939 and 1946, more than 34,000 German POWs were transported to Canada, primarily from Britain, where overcrowding and logistical strain made transfers necessary. Canadian authorities sought locations distant from active combat zones, while still accessible enough to manage daily operations and labor deployments. POW camps were distributed across the country. Some were near population centers, others in remote areas, often close to natural resources or agricultural projects. British Columbia hosted several camps, including one in Field, located in a mountainous corridor linking the Columbia Valley and the Selkirk Range. The camp functioned both as secure housing and as a labor source for forestry and infrastructure projects. Prisoners were transported daily under guard to nearby work sites. Terrain was rugged, and weather conditions could impede visibility, particularly during spring melt or early snowfall. Canadian administration adhered to Geneva Convention standards. POWs were fed, clothed, and provided medical attention. Recreational and educational programs existed in most camps. Guard interactions emphasized supervision over punishment. Escape attempts occurred, but were relatively rare due to geography, weather, and the logistical challenges of leaving such isolated locations. By early 1945, the war in Europe was entering its final phase. Germany faced imminent defeat. Morale in POW camps varied. Prisoners were aware of the frontline situation only indirectly, through newspapers, rumor, or correspondence. Some anticipated eventual repatriation. Others feared what awaited them in post-war Germany. At POW Camp 133 near Field, daily routines included work details in forestry, road maintenance, and small-scale construction projects. Guards maintained logs, recorded roll calls, and reported discrepancies through official channels. On April 27, 1945, during the conclusion of a workday in the nearby forested slopes, a roll call revealed one prisoner missing, Gefreiter Karl-Heinz Schneider, a German infantryman captured in Italy in 1943 and transferred through Britain to Canada in 1944. Initial assessments considered administrative error. Guards retraced routes, checked temporary housing, and initiated local searches. The area surrounding the camp included dense forest, steep slopes, and river valleys. Weather conditions, including overnight rain and lower temperatures, complicated search efforts. After 3 days, no trace of Schneider was found. Personal effects, footprints, and camp records yielded no clues. The escape was formally documented and classified as escape, status unresolved. By early 1945, Germany had surrendered. Administrative priorities shifted to repatriation and demobilization. Schneider's disappearance was noted but effectively archived. No criminal charges were pursued, and his file remained inactive in federal archives. Over the following decades, Canada's post-war record-keeping evolved. POW records were maintained separately from immigration and naturalization files. This separation would later become a central factor in the case's reactivation. The case resurfaced in 1971, decades after Schneider's disappearance, due to a systematic archival review initiated by Citizenship and Immigration Canada. At that time, the federal government was consolidating wartime records, including POW files, repatriation lists, and post-war immigration documents, into a centralized system. The intent was administrative clarity, not criminal investigation, but the process revealed anomalies. One entry drew particular attention. A German national born in 1921 in Baden-Württemberg, recorded as missing from Canadian POW custody in 1945, appeared to share biographical elements with a naturalized Canadian citizen admitted in 1951 under the Displaced Persons Program. The names differed slightly. The POW file listed Karl-Heinz Schneider, while the immigration file listed Karl-Heinz Schneider. The dates of birth did not match exactly, but were within a 6-month margin, and both individuals had rural German origins. Initial analysis suggested coincidence. Post-war Canada accepted tens of thousands of European immigrants, many German-speaking, and inconsistencies in documentation were common. However, a photograph in the POW file from 1944, taken in Britain before the transfer to Canada, bore notable similarity to a passport photo submitted for naturalization in 1953. The image comparison was done manually, focusing on facial structure, ear placement, and a scar along the left jawline. The similarity warranted further investigation. Investigators requested access to local records in Golden, British Columbia, where Schneider had been living. Property ownership documents, tax records, and employment forms were examined. A 1956 land transfer document listed previous residence as Field, BC, 1945, adjacent to the former POW camp. Forestry payroll records from the late 1940s listed a laborer named Karl Schneider, employed intermittently in the same region. These records demonstrated that Schneider had resided in proximity to his former camp during the immediate post-war period, without formal immigration status recorded for the first 2 years. Handwriting analysis was performed to compare signatures on POW documents with those on naturalization paperwork. While not conclusively identical, several features, slant, spacing, and letter formation, correlated closely. Shipping manifests from 1951 indicated that a Karl-Heinz Schneider arrived from Bremen, Germany, listed as a farm laborer. No criminal history or military service was noted in these records. Investigators compiled multiple data points: POW files, photographs, property ownership, employment records, and immigration documentation. Minor inconsistencies in dates and spelling were noted, but did not outweigh the convergence of evidence. By late 1972, the RCMP Special Branch was notified. Their role was procedural: confirm identity, verify documentation, and determine whether any legal action was required under Canadian law, specifically regarding misrepresentation during immigration. The investigative process was deliberate and methodical. There was no presumption of wrongdoing. The emphasis remained on verifying historical fact, not interpreting moral or political culpability. This approach preserved procedural integrity and minimized potential misinterpretation of Schneider's actions during the post-war years. The formal verification of Schneider's identity took place over several weeks following the RCMP visit to Golden. Investigators met with him in person and requested documentation relevant to both his naturalized Canadian status and wartime record. Schneider cooperated fully, producing his birth certificate, citizenship papers, and employment records. No objections were raised, and there was no attempt to conceal information. Parallel to these interviews, federal authorities continued a comparative analysis of historical documents. Fingerprints taken during naturalization were compared with wartime identification files. Photographs from the POW period and early Canadian life were examined side by side, confirming consistent physical features, including facial structure, ear formation, and distinguishing scars. Property records in Golden and surrounding areas corroborated his residence. Employment records linked him to forestry and retail work dating back to the late 1940s, consistent with the timeline following his disappearance from Camp 133. Cross-referencing shipping manifests, naturalization forms, and local municipal files reinforced the conclusion. The man identified as Karl-Heinz Schneider in Golden was the same individual recorded as a German POW who had disappeared from Canadian custody in April 1945. The official recognition of identity was documented in December 1972. At this point, authorities classified the individual as having entered Canada under his real name, albeit without disclosing prior POW status during the immigration process. No indication existed that he had committed any acts of criminality in the country after his arrival. The confirmation emphasized procedural accuracy rather than moral judgment. By methodically comparing multiple sources, archival, administrative, and biometric, investigators ensured that the identification was unequivocal. The evidence painted a continuous trajectory from wartime disappearance to post-war settlement, bridging nearly 3 decades without resorting to conjecture. At the conclusion of the verification, Schneider's legal and civic status in Canada remained intact. The outstanding question was administrative, whether omissions in his immigration application required corrective action under statutory guidelines, a question that would become the focus of subsequent institutional review. Through written statements submitted to authorities via legal counsel, Schneider provided a chronological account of his life prior to, during, and after the war. These statements were strictly factual, intended to clarify historical and administrative records rather than to justify or dramatize his actions. Karl-Heinz Schneider was born in 1921 in a rural district of Baden-Württemberg, Germany. His family engaged in small-scale agriculture, and his early years included both farm labor and vocational training. Education was limited but sufficient to provide literacy and practical skills applicable to technical and manual labor. He was conscripted into the Wehrmacht in 1941, assigned to an infantry regiment deployed to the Italian front. Military records show standard enlistment, training, and deployment procedures, with no documented affiliation to political organizations beyond mandatory service obligations. He served primarily in logistics and field operations, consistent with his training and assignment as a Gefreiter. In 1943, he was captured by Allied forces during operations in central Italy. After initial detention in local facilities, he was transferred to the United Kingdom and subsequently shipped to Canada in 1944, where he was placed in Camp 133. Administrative records confirm routine assignment to forestry work details, maintenance, and minor construction projects in nearby forests and river valleys. In April 1945, during a standard work detail outside the camp, Schneider left the group. Official documents classify this as an escape from custody, though no force or violence was involved. He carried only standard work clothing and survived by moving between temporary labor opportunities and unmonitored rural settlements. Federal records indicate that no civilians or camp personnel reported altercations, and no theft or destruction occurred during this period. Following the cessation of hostilities in Europe in May 1945, Schneider did not return to formal custody. Instead, he relocated to areas near the camp, taking seasonal labor positions and establishing steady employment over time. By 1951, he applied for immigration to Canada under the Displaced Persons Program, listing his occupation as a farm laborer and omitting prior POW status in accordance with prevailing administrative guidance. Immigration records confirm acceptance, entry, and subsequent naturalization. Schneider settled in Golden, British Columbia, initially engaging in forestry and later establishing a retail hardware business. Municipal and business records demonstrate consistent compliance with tax, licensing, and employment obligations. He married, raised children, and participated in civic initiatives, including donations to community fire response programs. No evidence exists in federal or provincial archives indicating criminal activity or civil infractions between 1945 and 1972. Employment and property ownership documents show continuous verifiable residence and lawful conduct. Photographs from the 1950s and 1960s corroborate social integration and community presence. The archival narrative depicts a life shaped by historical circumstance, wartime conscription, capture, and escape, followed by a long period of civic engagement and compliance with Canadian law. Schneider's account, supported by corroborating records, establishes continuity between wartime disappearance and post-war settlement without embellishment or conjecture. By documenting pre-war upbringing, wartime service, escape, and post-war integration, authorities gained a complete understanding of the individual's life trajectory. These facts form the basis for subsequent consideration of legal and administrative consequences. The confirmation of Schneider's identity prompted an institutional review of legal and administrative obligations. Canadian authorities faced a nuanced situation. The individual had entered the country with verifiable documentation, engaged in lawful conduct for decades, and had omitted prior POW status and escaped from custody in his immigration application. The legal question centered on whether this omission constituted a violation of the Immigration Act and whether it justified revocation of naturalization. From a legal perspective, the statute required full disclosure of prior military service and wartime status. Omission, even without malicious intent, could theoretically constitute misrepresentation. Precedent existed for revocation in cases where false statements affected eligibility or posed a risk to national security. In Schneider's case, however, the omission did not conceal any criminal activity or association with ideological organizations deemed prohibited under Canadian law. Humanitarian considerations were also relevant. Schneider had lived openly within the community for over 25 years. He had contributed to local commerce, paid taxes, and participated in civic initiatives. No record suggested harm to any individual or violation of public order. The question of intent was indeterminate. The omission may have reflected administrative simplification, misunderstanding, or an assessment that post-war circumstances made disclosure unnecessary. Authorities evaluated several factors: the passage of time, integration into Canadian society, absence of criminal conduct, and the non-violent nature of the escape. Legal advisors considered whether absolute adherence to disclosure requirements should outweigh decades of lawful conduct. The assessment required weighing statutory obligations against the broader implications of enforcing revocation on an individual whose life had long since stabilized. The case illustrates the intersection of law and human reality. The legal framework was clear. Full disclosure was required. Yet, the practical consequences of enforcement were complex. Revocation of citizenship would have rendered Schneider stateless, disrupted established family and community ties, and imposed penalties unrelated to any present risk. Conversely, failing to enforce the statute could be interpreted as selective leniency, potentially affecting administrative consistency in similar cases. No final determination had been made at the time of review, but all discussions within institutional records were framed in neutral procedural terms. Both the legal obligation and the human circumstance were acknowledged and documented. No language implied judgment or moral evaluation. Authorities were concerned solely with adherence to law and consideration of precedent. The tension between regulatory compliance and post-war assimilation exemplifies broader challenges faced by governments administering immigration and naturalization in the decades following large-scale conflict. Schneider's case became a reference point for balancing legal precision with the realities of long-settled individuals whose historical omissions did not result in harm. Following months of internal review, Citizenship and Immigration Canada, in consultation with legal advisors and the RCMP, prepared a formal recommendation regarding Schneider's status. The review drew upon archived POW records, immigration documents, property records, and employment histories. Every data point was cross-referenced to ensure procedural accuracy. The Minister of Manpower and Immigration evaluated the following considerations. Legal compliance. Schneider's immigration application omitted prior POW status, a technical violation of disclosure requirements. Passage of time. More than 25 years had elapsed since the original omission, during which no legal or criminal infractions were recorded. Integration into Canadian society. Schneider had operated a legitimate business, contributed to municipal tax revenue, and maintained consistent lawful conduct. Public safety. No evidence suggested any risk to the community or national security. Legal counsel advised that revocation of citizenship could be pursued but would likely be contested. Administrative precedent indicated that non-disclosure could justify revocation only in cases where omissions concealed criminal or security-relevant conduct. Schneider's circumstances did not meet these criteria. After deliberation, the minister issued a determination. Schneider's Canadian citizenship would not be revoked. The decision emphasized procedural compliance, noting the absence of criminal intent, the extended duration of lawful residence, and the fact that the individual had contributed constructively to the community. The recommendation explicitly avoided framing the outcome in moral or emotional terms. The decision was communicated through formal channels to the RCMP and local municipal authorities. Schneider was informed in writing and provided with documentation confirming the closure of the review. There was no public announcement. Archival records indicate that the case was classified as administratively resolved and filed for future reference. The procedural resolution underscored the emphasis on institutional consistency, legal interpretation, and administrative oversight. It demonstrated how historical records, once reactivated, could be evaluated in a neutral, methodical manner without resorting to moral or emotional judgment. The Schneider case remains preserved in federal archives as a procedural record. It has been referenced in legal and administrative studies concerning post-war immigration, naturalization, and the treatment of former POWs. The narrative illustrates the interplay between historical circumstance and institutional authority. An individual who disappeared from custody during wartime later integrated into society, establishing lawful residence, employment, and family life. Over time, the legal and administrative significance of the original event diminished, while the factual record persisted. The resolution demonstrates that law and human experience do not always align seamlessly. Administrative review followed clear statutory guidelines and procedural rigor, yet the human reality, a life established over decades, carried weight in determining practical outcomes. No moral judgment was necessary. The facts themselves dictated the framework for resolution. In retrospect, Schneider's story exemplifies questions that extend beyond the individual case: how identity is documented, how institutions respond to historical gaps, and how time influences the relevance of legal obligations. It reflects a tension inherent in post-war administration, where the imperatives of law intersect with the continuity of everyday life. The final consideration remains open-ended. When decades have passed and the life has been built in accordance with societal norms, to what extent should historical omissions govern present legal status? The archives retain the record, the law retains its language, yet the human narrative persists independently, suggesting that identity, belonging, and justice are rarely contained entirely within procedural frameworks.